Good morning, everyone. I think the time is there. Welcome to the third session of this topic about citizens' involvement in decision-making. My name is Toril Nyseth. I'm coming from UiT, the Arctic University here in Tromsø. I'm going to chair this session. We have 5 papers today, so that means the time is very tight, but we have help from the volunteers here in front and also from the technical personnel in the back. So I think it will work very well. It was very, very smooth yesterday. So, but you have to stick on your time. We will have somehow a bit extension from the topics from yesterday. Both, for instance, the Arctic Hub project, we will also hear from today. The SLO, that you know probably means social license to operate. We will hear more about that. Also about digital participation, but we also have some new topics. For instance, how do we involve the young people in the North, and also a paper about meaningful participation, which I think is very exciting. So I look forward to 5 very interesting papers. And in the end, we will have a panel discussion, and then I will have my colleague, Tore Ringholm, to assist me in that discussion. So it will be a discussion and also an opportunity to ask some questions. So then I would like the presenters to come here for the panel discussion afterwards. First, I will invite our chair from yesterday afternoon, Vigdis Nygaard, who's the first speaker, and she will talk about also again about the SLU, but you can present yourself.
Thank you, Toril, and good morning, everybody. So happy to see many people here. I'm Vigdis Nygaard. I work as a researcher at NORCE, and I'm located in Alta, a little bit further north from here. And I'm one of the participants in a Horizon 2020 project called Arctic Hubs. So I will present some deliveries in this project, but as Toril mentioned, we also had some presentations yesterday. So I'm trying not to repeat from what has been said earlier, but since there are some new people, there will be some overlap. This presentation is about the social license to operate, and we have tried to use this concept to do cross-industry research, and we think that there is some novelty in doing this. And who are we? Here you see the names of those people who have been active in this paper. So there are participants from Nofima, from Luke, SLO, UNITO, and Unilab. So, the background for this project. What are we actually doing in this project? We study global drivers affecting different industries in the Arctic and how increased industrial activity impact on local communities, what we call local hubs. So our definition of a local hub is a local community that we study, that we have in focus. And we are studying 4 significant industry in the European part of the Arctic. That means forestry, mining, aquaculture, and tourism. And we study how these industries interact with local communities where they operate to gain acceptance. So the research question for this paper is social license to operate, the SLO, a relevant concept for cross-industry research? And then a few words about the background of this social license to operate, because this has its origin from the mining industry and the Global Mining Initiative from 1998. And it was a response to the bad reputation of the mining industry at that time. And it came as a consequence that to get a formal license to operate from the government to meet regulatory requirements are not any longer enough. That these companies also need to work with the local communities. And at the beginning of this century, there was a lot of theories and scholars who worked with this subject. And a definition that is often used is from Thomson and Boutelier, from a paper in 2011. And they define social license to operate as a community's perception of the acceptability of a company and its local operations. But then this definition has developed further and brought in other aspects, and we see also from Pernod and Slocum that they have extended a little bit in their definition. They are talking about the ongoing acceptance and approval of a mining development by local community members and other stakeholders that can affect its profitability. So now they're also talking about SLO as an ongoing acceptance, that you have to work with SLO during the whole process of a mine, from the very planning to the end. And they also included other stakeholders. So it means that it's not only the local communities, can be others as well. And we wanted to find out in this paper if this concept developed for mining industry, is it also relevant for other industries that we are studying? So we started out to search in the literature. Is it used in forestry, in tourism, and aquaculture? And we saw, yeah, to some extent. It's more common in forestry and also in aquaculture, but very little used in tourism. We were also looking for literature using this SLO concept in an Arctic context, because we believe that it can be different from other countries, because much of the literature is based on case studies worldwide, and then you are in a very different context. And we wanted to see how can we as researchers contribute with new insights in this concept, SLO. And we as researchers, we are industry experts of this specific industry. I myself, I've been researching in mining industry, and the others are forestry, tourist, aquaculture experts. So by doing this kind of research, looking at the other industries, it challenged ourselves that we also have to look outside our own industry that we are familiar with. And we try to contextualize these industries in Arctic, because there are different contexts for this industry in the Arctic that can be different from other places. For instance, the communities, they are smaller. The communities, they are not so dense populated. And we also have this indigenous people as a very important element in the communities that we are studying in this project. So these are the very well-known models of social license to operate, as it was first mentioned by Thomson and Boutelier. So here you have this triangle. That we're talking about social license to operate, that it will reach a higher level when they work well with their local communities. So first they are crossing the legitimacy boundary, and then the credibility boundary, and then finally the identity boundary. But in this very simple model, it's only about the local community and the industry. But we have seen that other scholars has widened this concept and has also brought in governance as an important element in the model. So Zhang and Moffat has modified this model, and now it's brought in also distributional fairness, procedural fairness, and confidence in governance. So all this affects the trust in the industry itself, and not only the single mining company that we study. So this was just a background. So what kind of methods have we used? We have used mixed methods. We have tried to gather new data by using co-creation, for instance, public participants, GIS, and we have hosted several workshops in our hubs, but this method has not been used in all hubs, only some of them. So for those that we didn't have this kind of data, then we rely on data from previous projects. And because we are industry experts, that we also live in the hubs ourselves or very near the hubs, we know the history of this industry in this area. So we very much rely on previous experience and previous projects that we were engaged in. And we have also searched the research literature. So what are the challenges? What we experience is that we struggle to find a good definition of what is actually a local community, who are included and excluded in a local community. And another challenge is, how do you define an industry? Because it can be very, like mine, you think about one big mining facility, but other industries contains of very different activities, like forestry, for instance, cutting, sawmills, processing. So our solution was to write in a way that acknowledge these differences. And we have searched for a path elements for SLO in an Arctic context, which means that indigenous people as local community and affected by this industry must also be included. So we have been inspired by Wyatt. He has developed he has an article. It's developed in an Aboriginal forestry context in Canada. So we thought it would be interesting to find something that is not mining related. And he has these 5 different indicators: impacts on social economic infrastructure, on biophysical infrastructure, and effective management processes, relationship building, and respecting, protecting, and exercising rights. So by doing this, we came up with this kind of tables. You're not supposed to read this, but this is a kind of exercise. Here we have the different hubs, and here we have these 5 indicators. So this is what we did with all the industries. So I must say that this is still work in progress. We have gathered all this data, but actually tomorrow and Friday we are analyzing this data. So it has given us some new insight in context, but we find that spatial definition and understanding of local community varies. And we also have national peculiarities in license system in these different industries. I think my time is over, so just have a look here. And thank you.
Thank you, Vigdis. Hopefully we will have some time in the end in the panel to to maybe dig a little bit deeper from things that you wouldn't be able to say right now. And the next speaker is Ria Maria Adams. She will talk about what constitutes decision-making in times of climate mitigation and green transition, well-being of young people in Finnish Lapland. And she has a project that is where she is located partly in Vienna and in Rovaniemi, isn't that right? Yeah, please take the floor.
Thank you. What a great pleasure to be part of such an interesting panel with all these different talks about Arctic citizen involvement in various decision-making processes. In my talk today, I want to take you into the world of young people living in the region of Finnish Lapland and discuss with you how decision-making processes are connected to the personal well-being of young rural stayers. The results that I'm presenting to you today are part of a 5-year ethnographic PhD research where young people aged between 16 and 29 in various places across northern Finland took part. First, I would like to highlight the decision-making processes of young people. This includes the notion that there is a need to move away from a mobility imperative towards a more nuanced understanding about rural young people. Young people across Arctic communities are leaving their hometowns and are often moving to the more urban cities, as we have already heard in this conference many times. We often hear and read that this is because of the structural reasons, because it is necessary and unavoidable decision for them. Young people need to study, they need to work, and if that are not possible in their own hometowns, well, then the only option for them is to leave. But what if outmigration or leaving is not the only option that young people have? What if staying in itself is a cautious decision that young people actively choose to make? I think we as researchers should also start looking beyond the obvious structural conditions and acknowledge that staying itself is a process too. We need to understand that the decision to stay is often more harder and more nuanced than the decision to leave. Young people with whom I've been talking often say that they need to argue and explain to others why they have decided to stay. When everyone expects young people to go and leave, the ones staying back can be sometimes perceived as the ones who have not made it out because of a lack of ability to do so. But some of them want to stay despite most of their friends and families are leaving to more urban towns, and there are reasons for that. So let's have a look at some of these factors why young people decide to stay. The first one is being close to family and friends. It's often the social ties that are decisive factors for young people to stay. The stronger these family ties and the ties to friendships are, the more likely young people want to stay or return to their home communities. And this is linked to the feeling of a sense of belonging to the community. When young people feel that they are part of the community and when they feel that they have an important role, the likelihood for them to stay increases. One of the main reasons young people want to stay is connected to nature-based activities. And that connection with nature is an important aspect young people have been vastly describing. That connection to the nature is often hard to describe in words because it's something that you must feel, they say. And then, of course, we do have all the structural conditions that matter when young people decide whether to stay or leave. relating mainly to jobs and educational opportunities. However, young people who stay are often more willing to compromise and work in jobs that don't always match their education, or they work in temporary jobs like in the tourism industry, or stay in high schools or colleges that don't maybe offer 100% the specification that they would wish for. Another benefit in staying in rural areas is that living costs are often much lower than in urban areas. And I'm not talking here about the tourism hotspots where housing is increasingly becoming problematic. So young people felt that they don't have too many services, but the services that they had in their hometowns were sufficient enough for them to stay. Safety has been mentioned as another reason to stay too. Other important factors that add to the well-being of young people is being part of local initiatives, associations, sports clubs, and attending courses at the community college. And here, I really want to highlight that success can be achieved in many different ways. And moving to urban centers is not the ideal that everyone is striving for. But at the same time, these factors that you see here on the slide, that rural stayers list as reasons for them to stay, other young people, or most young people, say that these are reasons for them to leave. For example, they feel, or they can feel, that the community is too small, where everyone knows everyone, and they want to go to the bigger cities to study or to work. So remember that these reasons can be sort of reversed as well. In this presentation, I want to especially highlight the importance of local initiatives. Here we see a motorcycle workshop that the young work of local municipality has invested in. Young people can come with their 2 or 4-wheelers to fix their vehicles every week with the help of some experienced elders. That way, the intergenerational connections are strengthened too. In the middle, we see an initiative of a local circus. The picture is taken at their annual spring show, where I was impressed not only by the quality of the performance, but also how it brought the community together. We need to work on the perception that these Arctic rural towns would be somehow only empty and suffering from a loss. Of course, outmigration is happening, the statistics don't lie, but simultaneously, there are initiatives that are contributing to the viability of these towns. Young people often said that it's not the long distances that bother them, it's more about the connections between places that are tricky. While it is really easy to fly to southern destinations, for example, from Rovaniemi, you can get in the winter season to around 20 European destinations directly, there is a lack in connecting places within the region, which means that while vertical connections seem to be often easier to reach, the horizontal connections are more difficult. The lack of public transportation between Arctic towns requires young people to rely on a car, and if you are too young, the parents' willingness to drive. So while the Arctic is getting more and more hyper-connected and crowded to the outside, for young people, commuting between places for work and studies is not always quick and easy. Which brings me to another important topic of mobility. To feel content and well, they need to have access to vehicles and different modes of transportation. And for them, it's a huge deal when petrol and diesel prices reach new highs. They don't have the option, like young people in urban cities, to just change their mode of transportation. When they run out of money to fill up their vehicles, they feel truly stuck. for time reasons, I will spare you with the theoretical background of well-being and jump straight to the conclusions. What aspects are important when we think about empowering young rural citizens in the Arctic? First, it is important to study young people with them together and not only conduct studies about them. Engaging them actively in local initiatives and activities and allowing young people to be in key positions is vital for keeping young people in the communities. Investing in local infrastructures and mobility are key, not only for young people, but for the livability of northern communities. So many of them wish for better connections and especially better conditions of roads in the Fennoscandian Arctic. So maintaining and expanding existing educational opportunities and local services is key, meaning that the continuing trend towards centralization of services is not helpful to the viability of northern communities. Young rural stayers are satisfied and content with what they have, but municipalities and stakeholders cannot be cutting down more on the services. Thank you.
Thank you, Ria. The next speaker is Karin Boman from Copenhagen Business School. She will talk about what constitutes meaningful engagement in green energy contexts, experiences and views on indigenous and settler communities in Atlantic and Pacific subarctic Canada.
Thank you very much, and thank you for allowing me to present. I'm actually doing this presentation with my colleague, Professor Mark Stoddart, from Memorial University in Newfoundland. So we decided that because there's limited time, I will make the presentation, but for the Q&A, whatever, Mark will also be actively involved. How does this work? So first of all, what do I want to share with this within these brief 10 minutes? What do we want to share? A little bit about the project and the framing of the project, then something on our research methods also and the findings, and then outlining where we are in terms of the discussion and implications. So the project is called Towards a Socially Just Transition in the Arctic, Exploring, Theorizing and Disseminating Best Practice and Meaningful Stakeholder Engagement for Communities. This is a project that is supported by the Nordic Council of Ministers under the Arctic Cooperation Program. And if anybody in here, if there's anyone here from the Nordic Council of Ministers, I want to express our gratitude for the funding for the project, because this is really important to allow us to actually go out and meet local people where they are in order to understand about these processes from the bottom up and not just from the top down and based on lots of already pre-existing research. Important as it is, but so this is a 3-year project. We're actually extending it to 4 years because one of our key members has been on Finnish maternity leave, which is when I had my maternity leave in Denmark, it was only 6 months, but these days a lot of people are lucky to have a whole year. So because she's a key member, we've been allowed another year. So we're a little bit behind. We work with scholars from the different involved countries. We have a almost circumpolar approach. These days it's difficult to be fully circumpolar. Working with Northern Scandinavia, Iceland, Greenland, and Atlantic, as well as Pacific Canada in the north of Canada, as well as local partners and communities. The objective is to try to identify best practice. So there's a lot of research on things that don't go very well, and we really want to try to see if we can come up with some key pointers on what are some ways in which engagement and with an involvement of local communities in decision-making processes can work well. Not necessarily perfect, because as we all know, perfect can be sometimes the enemy of good, but trying to come up with findings on best practice. We found this is not easy. People are a lot more happy to talk about what doesn't work than what does work, so it's a little bit, an exploration, a journey to try to then pull out what actually does work well, so that we can build something for the future. And so our overall focus is on projects related to green transitions, given that this is both a global need, but also that so many activities, both on energy generation, but also on the natural resource extraction, in particular minerals, for the different types of technical facilities, solar power panels, windmills, turbines, for the green transition is causing a surge in mining, land-based, and we are even seeing now also moving into deep-sea mining in this part of the world. So we really want to try to see how local people can be involved, because the reasoning is that we need the green transition, we need it urgently, but if local people who are affected by it adversely do not support it, that will really affect the legitimacy. If it affects the legitimacy, we may have a little bit like a yellow vest opposition, or we've already seen in Finland, Sweden, and Norway, as well as Canada, we've seen protests and court cases. We've seen severe protests in Greenland, in South Greenland, around the Quanasuit or Kvanefjeld mine project. We have a history also in Iceland going back to the early 2000s. There is also the risk that energy companies will not step into they will be reluctant to step into the transformation of energy, because many of them are committed to corporate responsibility, or they are subject to legal requirements on not causing harm to humans or the environment. Investors may also hold back, and there's a huge need for investment in the green transition to be possible. So without having some sort of good practices for involving local people, so that we avoid the tensions, there is the risk that the transition will actually be delayed. Right? So that's the overall framing. So we do this at a comparative level from two angles, both geographical and topical. So the geographical one is looking at the different areas I already mentioned, and the topical one is we actually have both an invasive and a less invasive approach. The invasive one is on the green energy, recognizing that hydro, wind, and solar, as well as mining, all affect or may affect land and people's livelihoods and traditions adversely. They may also generate good benefits if carefully thought about. The less invasive one, we look at sort of projects that involve some element of nature conservation, looking particularly at UNESCO World Heritage projects. It just so happens, if you look at a map, many of the places in which we have these green energy projects in the global north, in the Arctic, are located very close to places where there are also UNESCO World Heritage projects. Whether it's coincidence or not, we don't know. What we've also found there is that this is not necessarily as sort of conservational or non-invasive as we originally thought. We found, particularly in Canada, we've seen examples of what is now UNESCO World Heritage projects that actually were perceived by people to be very invasive when they were created, by kicking people out of the area. So it's not as easy, but the idea would be to try to generate these ideas of what are best practice by talking to people about not just all the things that create a fear of your future and being invaded by these projects, but also trying to then get people to think about something that where they might feel less at risk, because like the World Heritage projects, in the essence, are about preserving culture, preserving nature, right? Even if it doesn't reality maybe work that way. A little bit on the Sustainable Development Goals that we work with. Of course, these are all interrelated. This is something we had to clarify for the project application. I will be a little bit brief on it, because the main thing is actually that, as you may be aware, if you've ever read the entire Agenda 2030 and not just looked at these icons for the 17 SDGs, that we have in paragraph 67 of Agenda 2030 on the implementation provisions, a call on governments and businesses to ensure that they do no harm in the process of doing good by the SDGs, explicitly referencing something called the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Some of you may be familiar with those. And these UNGPs are actually what informs, for example, what's going on right now in the EU in terms of developing mandatory corporate sustainability due diligence processes. But the idea is, well, these UNGPs, they apply to all businesses all around the world, including investors, no matter the size. And they embody this idea of risk-based due diligence process with the objective to identify and manage harm to society, especially around human rights, but because of the human rights impacts being so related to other types of impacts, including climate change impacts and environmental impacts, they're really across the board. And meaningful stakeholder engagement is a core element here. Meaningful stakeholder engagement is the idea that without talking to people who are affected, and mind you, when they talk about stakeholders, the idea is affected stakeholders. Affected stakeholders are for many practical purposes, rights holders, what we might refer to as rights holders here, but there is no derogatory intent. The idea is to talk about stakeholders because that's what companies talk about, right? If you say rights holders to a company, they will say, okay, go and talk to the lawyers. But if you really want to involve the managers, if you talk about stakeholders, they will think, okay, that's what I learned at business school. Okay, I take this seriously. So no derogatory intent, but just a way really to get into the minds of the managers. Right, so without speaking to the people who are affected or potentially affected, you are not going to really be able to identify the impacts and come up with solutions that are jointly made. So the method, we've been doing interviews and focus group interviews and individual interviews with communities in these different places. In the fall, we were in Atlantic and Pacific Canada. We still have to do work in Northern Scandinavia. Our findings are basically a series of tensions. And what I think the key message I can say at this stage is that we see this tension about a series of professed overall objectives of actually doing impact assessment with people so that their views are at least heard. It's like it's the right to have your say, but not to have your way, right? But precisely this idea of right to have your say, but not to have your way, creates a lot of frustration. First of all, because of the formality of the approach, very, very top-down from authorities and companies, and also because often it's probably not made clear to people that this is about learning their views, but it doesn't give them a right to have it absolutely their way, creates a lot of frustration. Also a sense that those who conduct impact assessment often come out and it's like a fly out mission. They don't take the time to actually get to know the communities in which they are. So some of the best practice experiences we heard were about people saying, but these people came in and they actually gave themselves time to get to know us. For example, in South Greenland during COVID, when people couldn't meet in large groups. So all of a sudden there was this experience. Now they came out to visit our homes rather than requiring us to travel for long distances, be away from our work, and being away from our sheep and not being able to do what we do for a living. Also, a really, really, really strong invitation for those who undertake impact assessments and in order to have meaningful stakeholder engagement, to really come out and be with people where the people are, not just those informal leadership roles, but come out and go to the local laundry, go to the cafe, go to the grocery store, and meet actual people and be there and be with them. Right? Also actively consider the notion of the option of not carrying out a project. Very often there is this idea that when impact assessments are being undertaken as part of a project preparation process, it's like a foregone conclusion, which means that any sort of stakeholder involvement or engagement seems almost meaningless from the outset. Why involve yourself in something if the decision is already made and you also have this idea that we will not have any influence in reality? It's just a formality for people to tick their boxes, right? And also, what we found about these UNESCO World Heritage Sites is also that, for example, one of the parks we visited in Canada, which built on a previous history of a Canadian park where people were actually kicked out of the park based on a way of thinking in the 1950s, 60s. There could be no people in a national park. And so that sort of tension around that things like that take a long time to remedy. On the other hand, we also found that this UNESCO World Heritage Site project site status may also be leveraged now to fight against new energy projects, like, for example, LNG projects that might adversely impact the area. So it's a little bit back and forth. In some cases, we also find, like in Iceland, that people actually learn to accept changes and maybe even like them, also for this particular national park in Canada, because there may also be benefits, right? So it's not always either or, but this doesn't detract from the importance of meaningful stakeholder engagement throughout the process and still looking at what is actually good practice for this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karin. Next speaker, we go straight ahead to Maike Knoll Kaufmann from UiT, the Arctic University of Norway. She will talk about institutional barriers to offshore renewable energy development, exploring sustainable pathways between top-down government and bottom-up mobilization.
Thank you for the introduction, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. Also, on behalf of my co-authors who are listed here, I will talk about barriers and pathways to sustainable offshore wind energy development in Norway. And this is part of an EU Horizon project, which started last year, so we're in a very early phase, which is a project with a focus on marine governance, with the aim to improve EU marine governance so that it can better meet the goals and objectives of the European Green Deal. The Green Deal is a package of policy initiatives relating to all these different pillars that you see on the top of this figure. This is a figure from the project. And we look into different sectors, marine sectors, and see how the European Green Deal goals are implemented in these sectors. And we contribute with a case study from Norway on offshore wind development in Norway. Our key objectives are to understand the changing governance of offshore wind energy in the EU and Norway, and how these are intertwined, because Norwegian and EU policy, climate policy, are closely intertwined. And to explore the barriers to implementation and to explore pathways for sustainable transitions. So in the project, we all the time look into what happens at the EU level, how that is connected to the national policy level, and how that translates into the local and project level when it concerns offshore wind. I want to say something about the key discourses and policies at the national and EU level when it concerns offshore wind. And with discourse, I mean a key term or a shared language that we find in the policy domain. So here, the policy domain around offshore wind. And of course, net zero emissions, climate neutrality is central here. Climate neutrality is the key goal of the European Green Deal, with the intermediate goal of reducing climate gas emissions by 55% in 2030. Both Norway and the EU have policies to reach those goals. And Norway's Climate Action Plan and the Fit for 55 package in the EU are the frameworks to reach this intermediate goal of 55% reduction. As we all have heard during this conference, electrification is a very key theme here in Norway with a very special meaning in Norway. Because Norway is, of course, a country with a large renewable energy sector already, but also with a large oil and gas sector. And the oil and gas production in Norway stands for 25% of the climate gas emissions in Norway. So the idea is that by developing offshore wind connected to these platforms can be electrified, and thereby the domestic emissions will be cut. New industries and jobs is another main theme or discourse that we see both in the EU and in Norway in relation to offshore wind. It's a new sector, it will create new jobs and a green industry. Energi til arbeid, Energy for Work, is a white paper, the Norwegian strategy for long-term value creation of Norwegian energy resources, really focuses on new industries and creating new job opportunities. It prioritizes the hydrogen and offshore wind sector, and especially in Norway, floating offshore wind. Floating offshore wind, it says, could create 52,000 new jobs by 2050. And floating offshore wind is especially emphasized because there's a comparative advantage in relation to the oil and gas, the offshore sector, the supply and service sector. And the last key discourse that I want to mention here is acceleration, which we find very strongly here at the national level and at the EU level. And especially since 2022, after the Russian invasion in Ukraine, the EU presented its Repower EU plan to reduce the dependency on Russian fossil fuels, increase the focus on Norwegian petroleum and renewable resources, and in the same year, Norway increased its target for offshore wind to 30 gigawatts by 2040. Now, what does that mean? At the moment, we have one demonstration project in Norway for offshore wind, 11 turbines. With current technology, 30 gigs will mean around 2,000 windmills on the Norwegian continental shelf. So you could say that Norway is a latecomer with only one demonstration project, and there's a huge urgency in Norwegian debate to increase this number of offshore wind fields. The map over there has been remapped several times. It presents suitable areas for offshore wind. This process started in 2010, coordinated by the Directorate for Water and Energy Resources. It's been remapped in 2023 with areas further off the coast to reduce conflicts. And I just want to show this because I want to say something about how we're going to work in this project with the different categories of initiatives that we will focus on. So we'll focus on the blue areas below, which are the two first fields that were opened in 2020, which are the regular fields following the Offshore Energy Act that have been opened in a governmental process. We will look into the barriers and pathways for sustainable transitions related to such fields. We will also look into the purple area above there, which is there's nothing in there now. As you see, there's not a governmental mapped area there either, but it's a field, Goliath Wind. It's a project that an oil company is now applying for, a demonstration project. So we will look into demonstration projects which are exempt from parts of the Offshore Energy Act and how different barriers to implementation and pathways for transitions are, what we can find there. And then the last category of projects that we will look into is Helgeland, or exemplified by the Helgeland coast in the middle, in the red circle. It's a very interesting area with a lot of mature industries, offshore supply, service industries, battery industries. And since 2019, local organizations have started to develop ideas for an offshore wind park and a multi-use park in this area. in collaboration with local stakeholders and also in contact with national policymakers. So far, nothing has happened there, and it's not likely that this area will be open before 2027. But large assessments have been made, and that's really interesting. We will look closer into this. Yes, thank you. For each of these areas, we will look into the barriers to implementation. And we've already started to map a few key institutional barriers to implementation. One of them is there have been and still are quite unclear legal and financial frameworks for offshore wind, both in the EU and in Norway. We've seen with these maps and with the consultation procedures so far that there are inefficient processes that take a lot of time, but that are also not necessarily always legitimate or considered legitimate. There are resource gaps, knowledge gaps, personal gaps, competence gaps that need to be filled. And of course, we've heard a lot about it this morning, there are conflicts. And there's this goals for coexistence between different industries. And this is something, coexistence, a discourse that is not very central in national and EU policy context, but you find this at the local and regional and project level. So some final reflections. There is a potential to enhance the integration of use and local resources and competence in what is mostly top-down offshore wind governance. Both to make these planning processes more efficient, but also to make them more legitimate. And we find already that coexistence is a key discourse that dominates locally and regionally and at the project level, but not at a national policy level and the EU policy level. And this is a tension that asks for reconciliation in some form, but we also need to be aware that there will also always be trade-offs that need to be made. Moving forward, we will collaborate with stakeholders in the project. We have stakeholders as part of the project, but also through workshops and through our data collection from the EU level to the very local level. And we will ultimately develop recommendations for improved marine, climate, and energy governance in this project. And there's a last slide with the website, if you want to know more. And if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Maike. Then we have one more presentation, which is Hans Christian Hernes, also from the UiT. He's going to talk about digital participation for climate change transition and the embedding in municipal planning.
Good afternoon. Sorry for my voice. I hope that I will do this with my fisherman's friend. It will work. And as you can see, I'm going to present, I have a little bit changed title. I changed the title because when we planned for this presentation, we thought that we will have data from our project that we wanted to present here. We have been delayed. I can explain that. But what I then planned to do was to talk about public value evaluation and the use of that in creating climate, energy, and environmental plans in Norwegian municipalities. And we think that we are doing something that's innovative when it comes to participation in these processes. The point of departure here is that Norwegian municipalities have a duty to make this type of plans. They have to make climate, environment, and energy plans. They have to develop them, they have to adopt them, and they have to implement them. the challenge for many municipalities and then in general is that it's low quality of these plans. It has been rather weak outcomes, and the attention to these issues have been quite low in municipalities in Norway. So there is a pressure for a new type of plans. There is strengthened ambitions given the international situation, we could say, with the climate, the agreements that's been made, and so on. But there is also a need to involve people more. It's a need to get more legitimacy for these plans, and there is a need to change behavior and to change the way that the municipalities are governing. We are working, and I'm coming to our partners, is that we are working with rural municipalities. They have some particular problems or special problems, and we think that they have challenges that are different from cities. They are losing the young. They have a population decline. They have trouble with taking care of the welfare services and so on. And what we also experience in this project is that there is a challenge to recruit administrative personnel. So for the municipalities, it's a problem to get enough planners so that they can make plans of this type. But they are strong in industries. One example is Senja municipality is the largest one that we are working with. They are exporting fish products for around between 8 and 10 billion Norwegian kroner each year. So it's quite many dinners that's produced in Senja, but they are also then relying on tourism and so on. But there is also an sort of climate rejection or asking, do we have to do something in this municipality? That's also a challenge here. Not in the administration, but in the public. So what we have is a project, Drivkraft in Norwegian, driving force, purely translated into English. We have 3 municipalities. We have Senja, which is an island about an hour with a boat from here. We have Vestvågøy, we have Vågan in Lofoten, and all these 3 are rather big municipalities in northern Norway. Senja is the biggest, it's almost 15,000 people living there. Vestvågøy is a little bit smaller, and then Vågan is the smallest, but still more than 10,000, I think. We are also cooperating with Lofotrådet, a Lofoten Council, which organizes all the Lofoten municipalities, so we rely on input from them. And we have a partner, Noravind Utvikling, a consultancy company. This project is a public innovation project. It's chaired by Senja municipality, and we have these partners, and UiT, together with Technische University in Delft, is the academic partners, and we have funding from the Research Council in Norway. So what are we doing? Well, we need to create new plans. We have 3 elements in the project, 3 innovative elements, because what's happening here is that this is not only about innovation, it's also about making plans. So the municipalities are working with the plans, and what this project is bringing in is 3 elements. We have one part, that's the Young Researchers project, where we ask pupils in grade 10 to 13 to work with companies to innovate and see if they can make projects that's important from a climate, energy, or environmental perspective. We have workshops in each municipalities, and we also have 2 workshops that's crossing or involving all the municipalities. And then we have the public value evaluation. That's what I'm going to talk about now. But this is our nice figure. That's what we are reminding us about what we are doing in this project. So we want to see, can these innovations be an input to improve the CEE plans in these municipalities, and what happens when they are implementing these plans. We are now in the phase where we are going to implement or start or do our PVE in these municipalities. It's been a very long process. We have been working a lot with the municipalities to collect information. We have tried to have discussions with representatives of the municipalities, and we have gradually developed topics that the municipalities think are important as input in their plans. And this has taken time, and I'm sure if we had made the PVE or done it earlier, we would have different issues or questions than we have when we are doing this now starting in February and carrying out in March. What we are doing here is that we are not having these common tools for involvement, public hearings or open meetings, but we invite groups to join and to take part at a digital platform. And people are then invited to answer questions, but the most important thing is that they are asked to make priorities. They are asked to sit in the chair of the mayor and say what's most important to do in this municipality. They are also, they can do this in a simple way. They can just push a button, but they are also then asked to give reasons for their values and choices. And they are asked about the PVE, what they think about this type of questions, and how the municipalities could or should use them. So what's important here is that we are using animation, we are using graphics, and we invite, we inform, and we try to find out or to get opinions in different ways. So we have first a part that's going on climate change. We know that there are climate skeptics here, and if they don't want to answer questions about that, they can go further on. We have, or they can just then leave and say that we are just saying something about the future of the municipality. But we then have two main parts. One part is that they should prioritize what's most important to do in this municipality. They have 100 points that they can give or divide between different topics. The second part is the one that they answer and try to reach goals. They try to obtain goals in the municipality related to environment, and also to see how this affects or how much input do citizens, businesses, and so on need to put into this. And we ask them about their motivation. Why did you choose this alternative when they have used the buttons? I'll stop there. We have tried it on the young people in Senja at school class. They say that this is a well-spent time and a way to involve the young people in making these plans. And they think that they want to give comments, they want to give their views and so on. Yep, I'll stop there.
You can just stay
stay on?
Yes.
Thank. Yeah. I could have showed you a video, but of the
Yeah.
animation. But
Thank
I
you.
can stand
Yeah, thank you, Hans Christian. I will now ask all the presenters to enter the stage. You have to stay on the panel discussion, but only for around 25 minutes. Toril and I will start with asking the panel a few questions, and then we will invite the audience to also ask questions or comments. Are you all there? You should be over there. We have to share this mic as well. I just want to start by asking actually maybe a very simple but also very challenging question. And that has to do with what are the best practices in related to citizen involvement. Some of you have touched upon it, others have discussed it more deeply, but I would like to actually have your quick answers, because we are not looking at only conflicts and challenges, but also to solutions in a way. So I think this best practice question would be the first one I would like you to have your few reflections upon. Who will start?
You just pass it along.
Yeah. Is it on? Is it on? Is it on? Okay.
Okay, thank you. I will start then. I think from an offshore wind spatial planning perspective, I've looked into the processes towards these identified areas suitable for offshore wind in the past, like what has been mapped in the past decade. What we see is that some of these areas that have been mapped by the directorate have gone through consultation rounds, and sometimes they were remapped, and lots of comments were put in by local actors and organizations. But at the more project level, we see that there are, outside of these official consultation procedures, there are arenas where companies and local stakeholders and national authorities meet, where there is a direct remapping to take into account, for example, fisheries interests. And it is in such processes much easier to come to early agreement, thereby also finding synergies, possibly. So more direct engagement outside of the formal consultation procedures that we have here in Norway is something that we see is really an issue that needs to be incorporated to a much larger extent.
Thank you. Ladies?
Sorry.
Yeah, I very much agree. And when it comes to different industries that we have studied, it's very obvious that you have to work much more, not only according to the what you are obliged to do according to the licensing process and so, but it's very important to, at the very early stage, to reach out of the local communities. And we see that this is pivotal, and there are so many examples of industry project that has really came out of different problems because they have not started early enough to communicate with the local communities. Yeah.
As an anthropologist and someone who works with young people, I would say it's like the continuous engagement with the people and with the communities. When I go to a small community with a questionnaire, I mean, there will be not many answers that I get, but if I come for the 4th time or for the 5th time, then they'll start talking. So from that perspective, I would say like many continuous visits and involvement with the communities long term.
Thank you. I would say to take the meaningfulness of the stakeholder or rights holder process very, very seriously, to really think about how a process can be designed from the outset to be meaningful for the people whom it's actually intended to benefit, to involve them in the design, and to think about what are the potential outcomes and benefits for them. And to the extent that adverse impacts cannot be avoided because there is an overall balancing, and sometimes adverse impacts just somehow maybe cannot be fully avoided, then think also about how those can be addressed in ways that are truly meaningful until the very end of the process. So this actually also means to really understand what is implied in this idea of corporate sustainability due diligence, which is both becoming a legal obligation for companies working in and outside of the European Union and the EEA area, is also already an expectation under the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and the UN guiding principles. So it's there, whether you like it or not. And companies, governments, other actors are really held to account actually from the social license to operate a perspective, even whether this or not this is something that's binding.
I don't think there is one single way to involve, and I think it's depending on who you want to involve, and the experience that we are departing from in this Drivkraft project is that we need to find methods to involve the young ones and also the businesses. And the way that we use this PVE is a way to, or a form where we try to find out whether this makes them more active, more involved. And just one small report from we had when we tried it on this school a week ago. One of the comments was that it was nice to give. They could both say what they meant. They could cross or find a solution, but or what they wanted to put across that. But they could also give reasons, and they could give reasons without doing it in the public. So having that opportunity is also important for them, because if they went to larger meetings, they felt that, okay, then it was the usual suspects that's been there, that was there, and they were arguing and they were looking at the young, it was a nice proposal, but here they could have a voice. So I think it's important to find ways that different groups can have a voice in a municipality, but also generally.
Yeah.
One more question, and then you will have your.
Yeah. Okay. You just keep the microphone in case you want to say something, because there are many practices. Some of them are good, some of them are better, some of them are perhaps best. What we see from the presentation, but also from the overall research on participation and involvement, innovations, new forms, new ways, new practices, is that they are very often case-based. They are based on a limited number of cases. And I just wanted to challenge you a bit and ask, are there any of these practices that could be upscaled, that could be carried out in as like a regulatory way of involving people, that could be embedded and enshrined in the Planning and Building Act, for example, or other laws regarding participation, that kind of thing? Could we lift them? Could we push them further up and do more of it? Or are we confined to carrying out case practices adapted to the particular context that they are carried out in? You don't all have to answer if you don't have an answer, but it would be nice to hear your opinion on it.
I think we can. I mean, we shouldn't just think that we are doing cases just for the case. but that we can learn from it, from cases. Is the challenge, I think, is to find ways to do it, and we need scientific papers and all books and all that for it. But I'm following some work that been doing on this mini publics and so on, based on this deliberative democracy. And I think it's the OECD that has made a report on different projects. So some sort of having people that's trying to make some sort of a variety and show different cases, and then maybe we can learn from them in a better way. So we need that type of processes, and practical guidance for how to design projects. And I think that this is important if, for example, a municipality wants to do something different. They need to find somewhere to learn from it, that they don't have to call me or call you, Toril, and ask what do you know, and so on. So I think that's important. I'm not sure if we can write everything into a law. That's I adopt.
Thank you. I would like to take that as my cues, me being the lawyer, but also the skeptical lawyer. I think we really need to be very, very realistic about how to transform the ideals that are usually incorporated behind a law into practices to avoid tick boxing. But I think in this particular case, and looking at the Arctic region, I think there are other issues that are even more important to consider, or as important in this process, and that is to recognize the cultural sensitivity of how you communicate, how you involve people, how to consider the various level of a communication process. For example, there's a lot of trust. There is also a lot of local cultural legitimacy, who speaks, who don't, who can voice something on behalf of others. For example, also for young people, can they step up and make their views heard without being told you don't know anything about it by the older people, and also respecting that in some smaller communities, as one of my Greenlandic colleagues told me once, he said, in the settlement where her grandmother comes from, saying nothing is also a way of expressing yourself. So again, if we then look at the way in which these formal inclusion and involvement processes are undertaken, usually there will be somebody taking notes, right? But they don't say nothing was said. It only records what was being said, which means that the way of expressing yourself silently becomes muted, right? So I think there are a number of very important processes that we need to take more account of, and I think also there's also a matter of not just expecting everyone to have this a very vocal way of expressing ourselves like we might do in the Scandinavian countries, maybe with a sort of maybe even a southern Scandinavian tradition that may not necessarily apply everywhere in this region.
Okay.
Can I briefly add an answer also on this topic? I think it's a key question, and it's a very important question to go beyond these cases and project and local level, of course, to think about what are best practices. And then, again, I want to give an example of offshore wind development in Norway, where there has been a lot of conflict in the past years about all these areas. And 2 years ago, Norwegian Minister of Energy established this collaboration forum with a coexistence group where representatives of the fisheries organizations are seated, and companies and governmental bodies, and they are now talking more together to design these rules of the game. And that we still, of course, have to look into at the local level how they are used and what they can do, but still there is this, through this representation in fora that are more regular and consistent, I think that is a step forward. I want to mention one other thing, and we talk a lot about coexistence, and also this morning, but it seems to be very much a spatial idea that different industries or different people need to coexist. We have a PhD student at our faculty working on this topic. Sorry for pointing at you, Claire, right now. Looking into, what does it actually mean? What are the principles of coexistence? Looking into different literatures on this topic, and I think widening that scope is important in all our work, and I think it connects all very well.
Thank you. Are there anyone in the audience? I can run around with a
Yes, there.
mic.
There's another mic there.
Yes, thank you very much. I just wanted to ask Ria, actually, did you look at people's reasons, maybe for young people's reasons for returning? Is that a thing? And also, I wanted to ask about internet connectivity as a form of. You talked about mobility and connectivity, but how about internet connectivity as a reason for staying?
So I did meet and interview also young people who have returned, but they would often be people who have left elsewhere to study or maybe even to work for a couple of years, and then a position opens up, let's say at the municipality or as a teacher or whatever they are trained in, that then they would come back home. But usually they would return if they have family there. Like, if you start getting kids on your own and then the grandparents live next door and then you find a work, then you can move there. And the internet connectivity, I think often we assume that there are many jobs where we can just work from a distance, but actually there are not that many professions that allow constant home office and for people to stay in these rural areas. So I do know that is a big topic that is being discussed about, maybe to attract more people if there is that internet connection, but it's still a question of what professions you can actually work from a distance.
Any more questions from the audience? Yes. We have one there.
Sorry to continue to Ria, Maria, but I'm interested because you talked about young people, but I think in that sense or in this context, gender differences are really big. So women leaving and men staying. So how did you handle that in your research?
Yeah, I have gotten that comment also on papers that I have been writing, that I did not make a distinction between genders, and I think it's also due to, in some communities, I did find females as well who were part of this group of content stayers who had deliberately made the choice to stay in their rural home villages. So that would be an interesting distinction in the future to even to categorize more between male and female stayers.
I wonder, may I ask, Mark, do you have anything to comment on any? Do you have anything, Mark, to add to any of this, my co-author? Okay. What about gender issues and young people in Canada, for example?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that was interesting in the work we did on meaningful engagement came up repeatedly in our fieldwork this fall, but wasn't directly related to our objectives, was conversations about daycare being a big barrier to either retaining people or getting people back into rural areas. So I think that was kind of a side kind of finding that wasn't actually lined up to our explicit research objectives, but for creating just livable communities in general. And I don't know if that would be similar in the Nordics, where maybe it's easier to do daycare infrastructure than in Canada, but that was a huge challenge for retaining or recruiting in young families.
Are there any more questions from the audience? No? I actually have one more for the panel, and that is we are doing research, you are doing research, we are doing research, several others are doing research on involvement and participatory practices. and together we know quite a bit about it, how it works, what works not. Should researchers take more of a lead and become more involved in involvement, given the urgency of the situation? Where's the microphone? Oh. Anyone who wants to? Now the microphone is passed around.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and I often feel when I'm engaged in my research that sometimes I'm also, my views as a citizen, sometimes in conflict with my research role, so you have to be very careful. But of course, some of these methods, it contains being an active researcher. So, but we have to be very careful about this boundary and maybe discuss it with our colleagues.
I'm in another project on ocean conflicts, and it's a big international conflict project. Sorry. And the aim there is also to transform marine conflicts, and by transforming, the project means that we actively engage in solving those conflicts. But it also requires that you make choices, of course, who to be in dialogue with, and how do you want to transform that actual conflict. And we, within our own Norwegian team, have been very hesitant in taking that role and being more, having this group of stakeholders around us, but still being in that critical, analytical position to describe what is happening instead of actively turning something into something new. Sounds a bit vague, but yeah.
Thank you. We have one more audience question there, or comment, maybe.
Okay, so this is for Karin, because I think it was interesting, this concept of meaningful stakeholder engagement. How do you find who are the meaningful stakeholders? Who kind of defines who are meaningful stakeholders?
Okay, so the focus is actually, it's the process that is meaningful. So it's stakeholder engagement is like the process. It should be meaningful for the affected stakeholders. So where does it come from? Who defines it? Well, the origin is actually the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. If you look at the explanatory comments, it's very, very clear that as an involvement process like impact assessment and follow-up must be undertaken in such a way that it is meaningful for the people who are or may be affected long-term throughout the duration of the process. So this has been taken up by the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises with elaboration. It's been taken up by the EU. It's been taken up by a number of soft law standards also, all around these different ways of corporate sustainability due diligence, which is about identifying impacts that a company causes and not risks to the company. So even though, so the thing is, when you look at the definition of corporate sustainability due diligence under whatever name, risk-based due diligence, human rights due diligence, whatever, human rights and environmental due diligence, and you look into the details, you will see that all the comments say that without meaningful engagement of the affected people, it's not going to work. You're not actually able to do it. Can I just add one thing to the previous question, actually? And that is, I think, one of the challenges that we are faced with as scholars is that the people, we involve ourselves in all sorts of ways, like here, like writing, publishing, whatever, but for most of the ways in which we share our results and publications are not accessible to the people whom we'd like to act on it, because they appear in journals that are either structured in such a way that it's not easy for ordinary people to read, or they're very expensive to get to access. And so I think that's a major challenge that we really need to confront also with policymakers and others, that as scholars, if our impacts and if our research is going to be impactful, then society needs to work differently with how scholarship is being measured and its impact is being measured, not just about these very expensive journals.
I think you're touching upon a very important aspect there. Absolutely. Should we wrap it
We
up?
have 1 more minute, so there's room for one more question.
One more question.
Yeah.
Good.
This is mainly for, I suppose, Karen. Excuse me. I come from a regional community, not from around here, obviously, but we've been involved in dozens of consultation processes for infrastructure reform, and now, of course, it's for energy infrastructure in rural communities. And even though we're on the other side of the globe, all of the things that everybody has said are exactly the same in our communities as well. And I suppose one of the things that I'm not hearing, that I suppose I hear a lot in our communities, are the sort of the cynicism, that this is a process of consultelling, not consultation. And in most of these projects, as in a lot of the big projects that are going through now, the outcome has already been determined. We've got major projects now going through for the creation of massive electricity works going through farmland, and it's already been determined. So even though you can go in, and this is actually my husband's job, he goes in and he talks to farmers, they know exactly what's going on, and they know that what they say means absolutely nothing, because the process of governmental uptake of the land can occur regardless of their saying. Do you see this as is there actually a difference in Arctic communities from Australian communities here? Because I'm not seeing it myself.
Yeah, no, I think that gets back to the theme about engaging earlier in the process. And I think one thing we heard a lot in our Atlantic Canada field work was, projects don't get in front of people until they're seen as predetermined, right? Which, so in the Canadian framework, it's when things get to the impact assessment stage that's usually where stakeholder engagement, rights holder engagement kicks in. So that was the one line that I think from one of our Labrador participants, I think summed up the level of cynicism we saw repeatedly was, we have a say, but we don't have a say, right? And certainly, and there we were talking about hydroelectric development, where there's plans in the ether for a new dam project some years after this last very controversial dam project, and the amount of cynicism that was like, why bother even trying to engage after we just went through this last multi-year project that's just been pushed through anyway. So I think that was absolutely, the cynicism is very much an outcome from not engaging earlier on at the visioning part of projects, waiting till it gets, into the impact assessment stage where people feel like it's predetermined. Yeah, absolutely.
So I think this is absolutely a very challenging issue these days, because on the one hand we have governments that are committed to climate change policies, and then that's about saving humanity in the long run, and then but how to make that balance so it doesn't disproportionately hurt or harm certain communities in the shorter run. When the Arctic, I think the focus has been a lot on indigenous peoples. It also has in some other way, in some other places in Africa and in Latin America. But I think, of course, there's a bigger issue in there, which is that how to achieve this balance. And so I just wanted to respond to your question on whether there is a difference between Australia. I don't know so much about the Australian stage here, but I think there are two interesting developments that have occurred, at least in the Arctic or sort of subarctic. And one is, the people here would know more about that, but one is the decision that was reached by the Norwegian Supreme Court in the Fosen case, saying that this is just too much, right? So there is a limit to how imbalanced the process can be, or how imbalanced the impacts can be. Now, if it's too much, too much impact on a community that the government might say, well, they can bear the brunt, but to some extent they can't, right? Then it's too much. The same for another decision that is maybe well less known, the so-called Yahey decision in British Columbia, where it was a similar decision made by the Supreme Court of British Columbia, saying that the impacts of industrial development, this was not really about energy development, but industrial development around in the sort of the area around a group of First Nations that were subject to one of these Canadian treaties, that was also too much. Like incremental, at one stage just becomes too much, right? So maybe that is a little bit the direction in which things are going, but of course there's a lot of harmful impacts that have occurred
Karin,
before.
we need to stop. We're out of time. So I would like to thank all the 5 presenters for very nice and interesting presentations. Thank you also to the technical expertise and to the volunteers. And please continue your chat and discussions outside.